So my name is Annalisa Hultberg, and I'm an extension educator in food safety at the University of Minnesota. I work statewide across the state to help fruit and vegetable farmers understand and implement good agricultural practices on their farms. So food safety practices from growing, harvesting, packing, storing, shipping, and selling their products to all kinds of buyers. This webinar series is intended for those who may have attended more of a comprehensive GAP training in the past or a FSMA training, but are looking for some more kind of in-depth analysis and discussion of some specific topics. So our first one is today. So thanks for joining. Just an overview that we do offer these GAP trainings, and I will schedule a few this winter online. We also offer a few in person. We do the FSMA produce safety rule trainings. That's the training that is required for farms that might be covered by this FSMA rule, meaning they need to comply with the FSMA rule. That's an 8-hour training, and that has a lot of good GAP materials and just general food safety materials as well. So most of the folks who attend that training don't have to be there for regulatory compliance, but they do it just to have good food safety information. And we always co-lead those with farmers like Laura. We just do general education and support. So if you want to write a food safety plan, if your buyer is asking about on-farm food safety, if you want to know where to get a water test, definitely reach out. We have a notes page for this series, and we'll make sure to put this in the chat. So this note series is a Google Doc that will have just notes and links that we talk about today. So we're not going to be really putting them in the chat because that can get a little overwhelming. So we'll just send this, and then you will all have this. Yes, we will definitely send a link. And yes, we can include a PDF of the presentation in this in a Google folder as well. All right, next. Just so you know, I know that you all registered for this, so you saw these, but we have many other dates coming up, so feel free to attend as many as you like. All right, next. So GAPs, good agricultural practices, we're minimizing the risk. These are things that growers do to minimize the risk, not eliminate. We're still growing outside or hydroponically inside, but there's always going to be some risk, right, of microbial contamination. We can't eliminate it, but using these practices has been shown to reduce the risk substantially. So some of these things are getting our water tested for bacteria, washing our hands, not working when we're ill, separating livestock from our produce as much as possible, things like that. One of these things really has to do with post-harvest and washing. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right, next slide. Why are we doing these things? We don't want to get our customers sick. Especially, I know many of us are doing farm to school, for example, selling into hospitals or places with children. These are immune compromised populations that potentially even a small amount of microbial contamination that is pathogenic E. coli, salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes. These are bacteria that in a healthy adult, you're going to have some GI distress, potentially some days of it. In some individuals that are sick or young or old, it can be much more severe. So of course we don't want to have that. So we're going to prevent this contamination in the first place instead of washing it off. You can't wash off contamination once it's on there because these bacteria are really good at sticking on our vegetables. So our goal is to keep it off in the first place. And it allows us to sell to new markets. Potentially, there might be a GAP audit involved. If you're selling to a distributor, happy to help with that if there are questions around that. And there might be regulatory compliance in terms of the FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule. That's a minimum standard for food safety that is now required for some farms, not all. Generally larger farms or those that are selling to distributors and places who are going to move their produce along. But really it does apply to all farms, because if we had an outbreak, and in some locations they have had outbreaks at places like farmers markets, it's not great for the local food system. And obviously all of us want to support our local food system and really see it expand, and all our farms themselves really expand if that's your goal. So an outbreak would not help that. And customers love it. So next slide. Why are we talking about post-harvest handling specifically? So cleaning and cooling is obviously a really important part of the process, right? We don't want our customers to generally get product that is covered in soil, that is dirty. We'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, not everything is washed. Cooling is also a thing that some of us do to take the field heat out and improve shelf life and quality. However, picture this tank here, and they're washing their summer squash, and it's in a tank, right? So if there was contamination on one of those squash, it might spread via that water to the other ones. And there have been a number of outbreaks that have been traced back to this post-harvest water. So we just really have to, there's some steps we can take, some good agricultural practices we'll talk through today to really reduce that potential for that contamination to happen. And bonus, have higher quality produce that lasts longer in our fridges. So it really goes hand in hand with quality. So that's why I'm the food safety educator, but we're really talking about product quality and shelf life here, because the same practices apply to all of these things. It's kind of, you just get lots of birds with that stone. So we'll talk through equipment, handling practices, and employee training, these things to think about in post-harvest to reduce the risk and to have the best quality product for our customer. So that's all from me.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful that you all joined us today. My name is Laura Cullup. I am an organic vegetable farmer in Hutchinson, Minnesota. I'm going to tell you really briefly about my farm because I want to have as much time as possible to talk about post-harvest handling. So I have been farming for 23 years. I worked on farms all over the country before starting Loon Organics with my partner, Adam. We started renting land in Farmington from a farm that we were working for and had an incubator farm there for 4 years, and then bought our current 40-acre organic farm in Hutchinson, an hour west of Minneapolis, in 2008. So we have sold to every market. We primarily were doing direct market sales for the majority of our time farming, and then added farm to school in 2020. And that became a big part of our business the last few years. And we were able to sell to our local school districts around here. So we've done both direct market, we've done wholesale, and really over time added to the infrastructure on our farm. When we first started farming and we're renting, we had a very low cost lean-to pack shed that we built off the side of a shed. And now we have both indoor and outdoor spaces on our farm. So we'll talk about a variety of, kind of meeting you where you're at and how you can accomplish the goals of good post-harvest handling practices and food safety, no matter the size and scale of your operation, whether it's a backyard garden or more. So let's get started. So as Annalisa mentioned, post-harvest handling, we're talking about really everything from harvest all the way to sale. So there's certain steps that happen along that way, and we're going to talk about it generally and also get into details of what different crops need. And so we'll be talking about the harvest, the washing and the cleaning process, the curing process for some storage crops, and then getting into packing and grading and storage. So getting right into it, an important thing for you to know is that when we are harvesting, our sale quality is never going to improve, right? So we are prioritizing harvesting high quality produce when it is at its best quality of ripeness. And from there on out, it's really like a race to maintain the cold chain if that product needs to be kept cold. Not all product needs to be kept cold. We'll cover that today. But for those crops that do need to be kept cold, we are continuously trying to maintain that low temperature so that we have good product quality, and we're also keeping that food safe. So how you can do that is to harvest some of these crops like leafy greens, like your lettuces, asparagus, sweet corn, berries, peas, things that want to be kept cold for optimum shelf life, to harvest those early in the morning. Also very important that you have clean hands, you're washing your hands, that you have clean knives and harvest tools, that your totes or your bin that you're using for harvest, everything is clean. So both thinking about this from a food safety perspective, but then also, like Annalisa mentioned, efficiency and saving time, less time spent cleaning product, right? So clean product that comes in, maybe it needs to get cooled off in some water, but there's not a lot of cleaning that we're having to do if possible. And in the process, we're reducing that food safety risk. Sometimes when we get into the washing process, we are washing to clean. Sometimes we're washing to cool. Sometimes we're doing both. So we will talk about hydro cooling today, and that is using cold well water, usually in Minnesota, to cool our product. It can also clean our product as well. So there's multiple things happening at once. This is a list here of some common things that are often and always washed. They may not necessarily need to be depending on the conditions, right? So if you are harvesting in the fall, for example, and it's 40 degrees and you're harvesting in a hoop house and that product is not dirty, maybe that doesn't need to be washed. Maybe it doesn't need to be cooled. Maybe that can go right into your cooler. So it really is going to depend on the conditions of harvest, and thinking about temperature, thinking about cleanliness, and also thinking about your buyer. So having a conversation with your buyer and what they expect in terms of cleanliness, I guarantee that none of your buyers will ever complain about your product being too clean. But the opposite can happen and will happen, especially if you're selling into wholesale markets. The standard there coming out of California, coming out of Mexico, is that produce is relatively clean, right? It's not coming in muddy, it's not coming in really dirty. And so there may be a cleaning process. So again, like a list here of some crops that are sometimes washed. Some growers may always wash that. Some growers may not wash at all. Really kind of depends on your particular situation and your markets. Some food safety considerations when you are washing and cleaning your produce. We use these 50-gallon bulk tanks for hydro cooling. Always important to have those up off of the ground. You can build a very simple platform to keep them up off of the ground. So you can see we have some very simple steel platforms to put our bulk tanks on. But also we have used harvest totes to put them upside down to keep the bulk tanks off the ground, to also keep the boxes that we're packing produce into, to keep that off of the ground. So again, that's both like a cleanliness, but also a food safety practice to reduce risk. The same goes for when you're harvesting. If you can keep your harvest totes, if you are using harvest totes that have holes in the bottom, and you're able to keep that off of the ground and just minimizing that contact with produce to both keep it clean and then to reduce that food safety risk. If you can keep hoses off of the ground. So if you do have a pack shed that is, like freestanding, either a building or a carport pack shed, next series on January 31st, Ariel and Annalisa will talk more about coolers and pack sheds. But if you can have your hoses coming in from the ceiling plumbed in so that you don't have a hose on the ground, that is ideal. Otherwise, think about having a hose reel. So something that you can have the hose up off of the ground most of the time, pull it out when you need to, and then pull it back in just to minimize, again, that source of contact between the hose, which may be close to your produce, and the ground where we're walking with our footwear. Animals may be walking as well. On a smaller scale, if you don't need a 50-gallon dunk tank, there are lots of options for smaller designs. So I just wanted to highlight a few practical examples of what that could look like. In the notes page for this series, you will have links to this picture of the 3-bin washing system that is on the extension website, and it will go through the list of supplies and materials and tell you how to build that. But that can be a really excellent thing. You know, if you're just getting started on a small scale backyard gardener, that will be a wonderful way to be able to wash and spray your produce, even dunking it multiple times without having a large space or a really large bulk tank, which is a lot of water to deal with. The other thing that I liked is these tubs, these 7-gallon tubs from Johnny's. These are all purpose, so you could use those for harvest. You could also use them for washing. I would recommend having separate totes that you're using for harvest versus for washing, right? So like you're not taking it out into the field and it gets all dirty and then you bring it into your pack shed and you're filling it with water, but be able to have like a clean one that always stays in your pack shed, and that's your washing tote. And then you have your harvest one. So those are a relatively inexpensive option as well. And then if you do have a larger volume of product that you're moving, many farms like ours will use these large dunk tanks. There's 50-gallon tanks, there's 100-gallon tanks. They're very common. You can pick them up locally at some of these stores, and I put the current price that I had looked up recently for them. The great thing is, you know, you can clean and sanitize them, so you can use them. I think we've probably been using these for 15 years. So they last a very long time. In the 50-gallon size, you can fit around 24 to 30 bunches of kale, for example, or heads of romaine lettuce per tank, or 10 to 15 pounds of a baby salad mix. And what we do is we're using potable water. So it's well water that we're testing to make sure that it is free of E. coli. And then we are also using a sanitizer, and we are using a sanitizer called Sanidate 5.0. I'll talk about that in the next slide, and talk a little bit more about that kind of bulk and batch washing and why we use sanitizer. One thing that I have highlighted here is that if you are growing sugar snap peas, that those should not go in water that has Sanidate. It will turn the peas will bronze, and so it will actually change the color. It doesn't affect the taste or anything like that or the texture, but it is discolored, and that can be off-putting to customers. So if you use Sanidate and you grow peas, I recommend having a sign up, because many times we would just dump the peas in and forget that we needed to have water without Sanidate there. So the reason why we use a sanitizer and why it is recommended is, as Annalisa mentioned, with these bulk wash water setups, if you have a product that, for example, has bird poop on it and you don't see that, it is missed, it's within the curl of a leaf. Or maybe it has come off, but there's still some pathogens here that will help prevent cross-contamination to other produce in that bulk wash water. The win-win of it is that it does also help extend the shelf life of the product when you're using that sanitizer. And so I included some basic information about Sanidate and the recommended amount per gallon. And then also you'll want to purchase, along with the Sanidate, some test strips so that you can then check your levels and make sure that you are not adding too much or too little Sanidate, right? You're paying for this. You want to make sure that it is effective, and it is you know, it's not extremely expensive because it's so concentrated. So I had here 2.5 gallons for $104, plus there will be some shipping costs. That typically would get us through at least a season, depending on how many leafy greens we were running through and needing to wash with Sanidate. So you're using, just a couple ounces for a 40 or 45 gallon tank that you're filling up. Chlorine can also be used, but we have always used Sanidate. It's approved for use in organic production and certified organic farms. And then I also love it because we can use it as a surface sanitizer. So I can sanitize my food contact surfaces. And we'll talk more about that later on, but that happens every time that we're harvesting. On a larger scale, farmers may want to consider a sanitizer dosatron. So this would be an automated dosing system. And the nice thing about that is you don't have to worry about, putting on the protective gear and training everybody and making sure you get the exact right amount for what you're doing. This will just automatically dose for your system. So that's something that you can explore if you have a building, if you're building a pack shed and are a larger operation. So in talking about this wash water and batch water, a question that we commonly get is, when do I change my water? Do I have to change it every time I put a crop in between? And, the answer is that it really does depend on what you are washing and how dirty your product is. And also if you're using sanitizer or not. So dirty water will decrease the effectiveness of your sanitizer, especially chlorine. And if you are reusing wash water, like on my farm, I'll bring in, 30 bunches of kale and I'll wash that. It will be very clean. Then I may be bringing in some head lettuce and I'll wash that in the same water. And depending on how clean or dirty that romaine is, if it's relatively clean, especially if it's from a hoop house, then I might put a dirty crop like carrots in. So I've now had 3 different crops in that wash water, which is a bit of a risky practice, considering that there is that risk for cross-contamination. So using a sanitizer helps me reduce that risk and be able to continue to use that water if it is looking clean. When you are having other folks on your farm or volunteers that are helping you, you definitely want to make sure that folks are trained to know when they're changing the water. So this example here, we see some pretty dirty wash water for some salad greens here. So in that case, looks like they're washing them in 3 different bins. However, you would want to change that water and have it be cleaner, earlier in that process. You would never want to wash or cool relatively clean product in dirty water like you see here. And then lastly, this is a tool called a Secchi or a Secchi disc. And that is a tool that you can use to measure turbidity and then train employees to use. So if you do have a larger farm, that's a disc that maybe you would take a sample of water and put it at the bottom of a mason jar or a container, for example, and see if you can see that. It helps you measure the turbidity or the dirtiness of your wash water. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about some mechanized washing equipment for larger scale farms, just so you know about this and are aware of it in case you're scaling up or want to think about how you can have your washing and cleaning be a little bit more efficient. So there is a product called a brush washer. And I did list some of the crops that we use. I should mention, for a brush washer, you can have soft bristles, you can have medium bristles, you can have a brush washer that has brushes both on the bottom and on the top of the brush washer. And so it really is going to depend. You want to think about what crops you will be growing and using in a brush washer. We have softer brushes so that I can wash cucumbers and peppers and even summer squash and zucchini. I can also wash dirtier crops like winter squash and watermelons and sweet potatoes. It does require more work of the person feeding in the product, sometimes for them to hold the product, or we pre-soak the product before we're running it through the brush washer. So you can see where to source that. It can be expensive, of course, but you can buy it in parts and pieces. This would be a great piece of equipment to look for some grant funding to supplement the cost of if you're interested in that. When we get into talking about using equipment for washing and any food contact surfaces in our pack shed that we're washing and sorting and packing produce on, you need to have a regular cleaning schedule for that. And also think about food safe contact surfaces, right? Cleanable surfaces where you're actually able to wash it with soap and water and use a sanitizer on that. So I included this picture, and this was from a number of years ago with our brush washer, before I knew as much as I do now about food safety. And so you can see we were using a burlap sack to kind of cushion. There was a drop where the produce was coming out on the outfeed, and then it was dropping down. So we were using a burlap sack to kind of cushion so that the produce wasn't getting bruised. But, that became really dirty. And you can see the table itself that we were using probably at the end was pretty dirty. So it's really important especially with this equipment, to make sure that you have instructions for how to clean it. You have a process, and everybody knows before you use that machine, after you use that machine, it's getting cleaned regularly. Okay, so moving on to spraying, using water to spray to both clean and cool. Typically, spraying product is using to get it clean, right? Because it's not going to drop the temperature that much of the product compared to hydrocooling, but it still will. You can do it very simply by hand with a hose and a nozzle or a pressure washer. And then for a larger scale farm, once you're getting into washing hundreds of pounds of root vegetables a day, it can make sense to look at a barrel washer. So we'll talk about both of those. It's important to know that spraying is considered single pass water, right? It's not being reused. It is falling onto the ground. It's not sitting in a tank that is being used to wash other produce, so it's less risky. There's no need for using sanitizer in your spray water. So we're using just our well water. It should be potable water. It should be free of E. coli. We're using our well water. We just have a hose and we love these heavy duty shut off valves. So you can adjust the pressure and have, more water or less water come out, kind of considering the crop. Um, it is important to know that things that are very tender, like baby salad mix or lettuce heads, I might spray the bottom of a lettuce head if it was really dirty, for example, but I wouldn't be spraying the leaves because it can bruise the leaves. And so you all might be familiar with what that looks like. They'll kind of turn like a darker green color and be a little bit, soft and tender, and then it'll break down. It will rot. It will turn mushy. So just really focusing on the roots and the root bunches for spraying. And then for something like this, we'll talk more about storage, but it also helps having that water on the product can help keep humidity up in storage, which also will prolong shelf life depending on the crop. But we're going to talk more about storage as we go along. Some very simple and low tech, low cost examples of spray tables. So the plastic greenhouse bench tops are extremely inexpensive. You can purchase those from places like Knowles Produce Supply, from various places, and have those on a like a bench top or a wooden table or stainless steel if you have something like that. And that is very, again, an approved food contact surface. It's very easy to clean and sanitize. The hands-free washer, there is a link to this for at University of Vermont Extension to kind of see how that works and to see how to build one. There's also a picture of one at our farm that we built. And I would say that it has gotten mixed reviews from our staff. So because it's higher, you do get more wet when you're using it, but it's great to be able to like have both of your hands free. So we just wear rain gear or we wear an apron. Just know that you're going to get wet if you're using a hands-free washer, but very low cost. And it's great for small operations if you don't have a lot of people to help you in your pack shed, that you can have that going and you're not holding that hose and one hand is always spraying and then you only have one hand to move things around. So an efficiency tip for your pack shed. And then for a barrel washer, this again is just to help mechanizing the root washing. I will also say our farm, we are growing on very heavy clay soil. And so our bulk roots are typically very dirty and sometimes even are stained from the soil. So we may soak that product in water, but then even spraying it with a regular hose, it can be challenging for it to really look clean. And especially for, even farm to school, it's so much easier for them. They're typically serving carrots raw. They want that to be as clean as possible. And then, of course, farmers market or other direct market customers are also going to appreciate a very, clean root. So a barrel washer for us helps us get our bulk roots cleaner than what we can get with spraying. And it's also much more efficient. So again, that these can be expensive, not as expensive as a brush washer, depending on where you're buying it. Grindstone Farm has a wooden barrel washer. The picture here is one from our farm. It's not from Grindstone. We built our own. You can also find plans if you have somebody on your farm who is very handy, who can build one for you. You can find plans for how to do that. It's fine to have wood, but you do need to be able to still clean it and let it dry in between uses. Knowles Produce Supply has a barrel washer that is metal and stainless steel. And so that again is great. That's a great food contact surface. It will last for a really, really long time. So if you are getting to the point where you're washing more than 100 pounds of bulk roots a day, barrel washer is going to be a huge game changer and time saver for you. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about crops that don't need to be washed. And not all crops should be washed, and you may not want to wash crops. And also think about, at the beginning, I talked about crops that could be washed sometimes, things like broccoli, things like cauliflower. Is there a way for you to save a lot of time by not washing that product, by harvesting that early in the morning, and also by managing pests so that you don't have cabbage loopers or worms that are in that product that you're going to have to remove? So if you're an organic grower, that may be managing them with BT, with Dipel. If you are a non-organic grower, you have other options. But again, it is a balance between wanting to have clean product, but also needing to be efficient and saving time. So it will depend on the crop. In general, you don't want to wash berries. You don't want to wash tomatoes. Some growers, I have known a couple growers who do wash their tomatoes with the softest brushes on their brush washer. Um, it's why I like to grow our tomatoes in a hoop house or stake my tomatoes so they're up off of the ground and they're not getting dirty. I also make sure that we don't pick our tomatoes too early in the morning when there is dew, because then just handling them with our hands can make the tomatoes dirty. And so we'll use like you can kind of see in this picture on the bottom with the worker unloading tomatoes from the golf cart. He's wearing some white cotton gloves. We'll use those when we harvest tomatoes so that we are able to do a little bit of polishing. And those are like a one-time use. After we're done using them, they get washed, and we're putting clean gloves on when we're harvesting. If the gloves get contaminated with something, we're changing them out while we're using them. Absolutely not a requirement to use gloves, but make sure that you're using clean gloves and clean hands that are going into that. Basil and then tomatoes or sweet corn as well are things that typically are not washed. And then there are things that are sometimes, right? The peppers, the eggplant, the cabbage, and the broccoli and cauliflower that I mentioned. Most fruits and vegetables do not need curing, but a few do. A few of the storage vegetables like onions, garlic, pumpkins, winter squash, and sweet potatoes. Some ideas for how you can cure that. It can be very challenging to cure these crops in the field, at least in Minnesota. It can be too hot, or we can have rain or just excessive dew, like not enough air ventilation. Because what the curing process does is you are drying down that product. So the curing is healing wounded areas on the surface of the fruit or the tuber. It helps the neck and the outer skins of the garlic and onions dry before long-term storage so that then they can be in storage for, over the winter in good shelf life. And it also helps prevent pathogens from spreading in storage, so that you're not having some diseases. So dry is really important. So a greenhouse with a shade cloth, a pack shed, a barn, any place that you can keep it dry and have good ventilation. So whether you're able to open up the sides of a greenhouse or a hoop house, or you're able to put fans on that product, it's going to depend. We have more information about the actual curing for each crop. But that is going to, the time will depend on the conditions, like how dry is it, how warm is it. Be mindful of keeping pests out and keeping that product off of the ground, especially the squash and the sweet potatoes. The mice will go for that, if they have the chance.
Laura,
So,
two
yeah,
questions. We have two questions in the Q&A, and I don't want to get too
go
much
ahead.
further. So the first one is, I'm curious about the choice or trade-off of washing something specifically like cucumbers and zucchini and the subsequent storage change. Dusty but not muddy cukes seem to last longer in the cooler.
Interesting. Yeah, and I would say we wash our cukes typically because we have more dirt and dust on them. But I do know growers who just do a really quick spray when they come in from the field just to get that dust off. If you're finding that they're storing better by not washing them, and you're not having any complaints from your buyer, I would say it's great. It sounds like you are doing what works best, for your operation. You're getting them out of the field before they're too hot and they're clean enough for you. So again, it's with something like cucumbers, there's not a hard and fast rule about that. It's just like really important not to harvest cucumbers in the afternoon. Let them sit in the sun while you're finishing harvesting the field, and then they're getting up to a really high ambient temperature. And then going into the cooler, it's going to take them a really long time to cool down. So, and then another question.
Yep, it was, and now a couple more have come in. So I'm wondering how to do the spray wash and immediately pack the produce while the root crop is still wet.
Yep. So, um, basically, like I don't want it to be soaking wet, but there's still some moisture on there. And so basically it's working in batches. So I may be washing, 40 bunches of radishes. I can fit 40 bunches in a bushel box. So then that's getting packed up. That's going into my cooler, and then I start the next round. And the radishes that haven't been washed yet are sitting in my bulk tank, or they're sitting in the shade in my pack shed or out of the sun. I've worked on farms that have had sandy soil, and all they needed to do for radishes was give them a dunk in water. They didn't need to spray them. So it was just a really quick dunk. They were maybe in for, 10 minutes, up to 20 minutes. And then we just packed straight from there, but we gave them a shake before we put them, like, I don't want it sopping wet, but I do feel like in terms of like longer term, like freshness and shelf life, if they do have a little bit, if the leaves are still damp, it does help keep that humidity high for them. So you'll see as we get into storage, a lot of those leafy greens, they want a very high relative humidity. It's hard to keep your cooler at 95% relative humidity if you have a little bit of moisture on the leaf. And that is something that you'll kind of experiment with. Sometime you may be like, ooh, that was too wet. That's getting slimy. But if it's not stored in a plastic bag and it's in a box, there is some ventilation happening there, but it can still help keep the humidity up. So I hope that helps answer your question.
All right, then a clarifying question. On your farm, are you doing wholesale, CSA, or food stand?
So we've done all of that all at the same time. We've done farmers market, CSA, and wholesale all in the same year. We've kind of gone, 90% direct market some years and 10% wholesale. And then last year we were about 90% wholesale and 10% direct market. So we've been all over the place. I would say generally the way that we are doing post-harvest handling doesn't change. Same quality, same handling, regardless of account.
All right, then last question before we move on. Could produce be cured in the sun if off the ground and then could get covered at night?
Um, you don't need to worry about covering it at night. What you need to watch out for is that it can be too hot. So you can see here on the curing information, the optimal temperature is really not going up above 85 degrees. And so when it is hotter than that, especially like if it is, if you think about when the time of year that you're curing onions and garlic, mid-July to early August, it can be 100 degrees and beating sun, and the ground gets hot. So then what happens is the onions they can green. You can actually get some damage on the onions themselves. That being said, I have done some field curing. So we've just pulled the onions, we've put them out in a windrow on top of the soil, and we knew it was going to be about 80 degrees and some brisk wind, no rain. So we've done that, and started the curing process in the field, but then typically you need to bring them back in somewhere where they can continue to dry. Because you can see here, it can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the conditions themselves. So like garlic, a lot of people, I had a picture of the bunched garlic that people are hanging up from rafters in a shed or in a barn. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but just watch out for like really high temperatures. The pests are not as much of an issue for onions and garlic. The pests stay away from those crops. They are not palatable to them. So I'm less worried about that compared to like winter squash and sweet potatoes. So, okay, any other questions that I can address right now? So, all of this curing information is also on the University of Minnesota Extension website. We have a link to that in the notes so you can look at specific crops and you can read more about that. And then, make sure that you are noticing that there's a difference between the curing conditions and then the long-term storage conditions. Those are vastly different. And so I want you to just think about what you are growing on your farm, what you are having challenges with, and do a deep dive on that particular crop to learn more about what you need to do in the post-harvest handling stage. For us, I want to share just a quick story. We had onions that we were keeping in our greenhouse too long, beyond the 4 weeks, because we weren't cleaning. We didn't have enough time to get them out of there and clean them. And what was happening is then they were developing like a black rot, and the onions were turning soft because it was excessive high heat for too long, right? So we learned our lesson by losing a lot of our onions because they didn't store because of this black rot, which turned them soft. So be really paying attention to the difference between curing and storage is important. Okay, so we've covered the washing, the cleaning, the curing for some crops, and now we're going to cover packing, right? So packing up that produce that is going to a buyer. If you're selling it direct to consumer, you have a lot of options for how you're packing. You can pack whatever works for you or however you're selling it to your customer. If you're selling bulk greens and bushel boxes, that's how you'll pack it up for them. If you are selling wholesale, there are specific packing standards. And so they can vary depending on crop and depending on buyer. So I want you to always check in with your buyer and just verify that what you think is a case of cucumbers is what your buyer thinks is a case of cucumbers. Are you on the same page? It's a 20-pound case, or are they expecting a 40-pound case? So the case size may go by the count, like the number of apples that will fit in that container, or it can go by poundage. And so that could be, like I said, 20 pounds of cucumbers, which will fit into a 5/9 bushel box. Uh, the visual aid that I have here, that is a list from the SARE Wholesale Packing Resource Guide. So that's just like a place to begin. If you are really unclear of how you're packing produce and what that case size would be, that's a good place to start. And then you can talk to your buyer or talk to other farmers and find out what they're doing as well. So the other thing, especially for wholesale, is that you do need to learn the packing standards for the crops that you are growing. For wholesale and farm to school accounts, they're accustomed to grade A produce coming from the larger farms in California and Mexico and elsewhere in the world. And I will say it's a pretty high level of quality. Think about the produce that you're seeing in the grocery store. You're not seeing a lot of produce, a lot of cucumbers that look like this. So this is from the USDA AMS site. There is a link to this. The most helpful thing about that site is that it has these visual aids. So look for the visual aid guides on the USDA AMS site for your crop. You can select crops from a drop-down menu, and it will give you examples of what is not grade A, or kind of what is acceptable, what is the limit, and the size and the shape for wholesale. So if you haven't sold wholesale before, really recommend that you do some research and figure that out. Because when you're packing your product, you're going to need to be sorting into grade A and grade B. It can be great on our farm, to have customers that you can sell grade B product to that might want to make pickles from it, or they might want to can tomatoes. You also need to know what is a compost product, what is not a grade B product, an open wound, something that is oozing, something that is diseased, that is just not marketable. But maybe there is a way that you can sell your grade B and still get some income from that and have it not go to waste, right? So that's a very helpful resource. And then getting into the actual packing, some practical information about what waxed produce boxes that you are going to want to use. You can buy them from Jordan Seeds. And if at all possible, it can be really hard when you're a small grower. But if you can buy in bulk, you can see you can get a discount. If there's any way that you can go in with other growers and buy a pallet of boxes and then split them up just to bring down the cost, that can be a nice thing. Boxes have gotten really, really expensive, and it is just a cost of doing business now. So make sure that when you think about the price of your product, if you know you're not getting that box back, think about how you're going to incorporate that cost into the price of your product. So for the most part, when we are packing product into boxes, we are using plastic bags or we are using freezer paper as a liner for our boxes. Plastic bags are a bit of a necessary evil for fresh produce. It does keep the humidity up. It keeps your leafy greens from wilting. So especially for baby salad greens, spinach, things like that, we're always packing that into produce or to plastic bags to keep that humidity in and keep that product fresh and have a longer shelf life. In the cooler, there's a lot of air moving, and so things can dry out. And so the things that you really are, if you're having a problem with things wilting, you may want to consider storing it in plastic bags. There are links to those products and where you buy them if you want to check them out on the note sheet. Reusing boxes, because boxes are so expensive, of course, we want to be able to reuse them if we can. Make sure the box is clean, especially if that box left your storage, right? It's not like you're just going to market, you unload, you take your boxes home. If that product is being dropped off at a school or at a restaurant or at a food shelf and they're saving your boxes for you, make sure they're saving your boxes in a clean, pest-free place and that you're inspecting your boxes when you get them back. And really gross boxes should be thrown away. It's just not worth it. But also it's another reason why I like to use a liner, whether that's either, you can see with the tomato box, I have the freezer paper on the bottom. We also put freezer paper on the top. And then some of the larger boxes with the leafy greens will get plastic. Also, our bulk roots that are going to be in storage for a long time get stored in plastic bags. Okay, a really key resource here is the crop storage temperatures and the expected shelf life. So if you're not storing your product at the temperature that it needs to be stored at, you have a shelf life problem. And really important to spend some time. There's a link to this. This is on the University of Minnesota Extension page. And so spend some time on this and look at what you're growing and think about, your post-harvest product and process and how you can maintain that cold chain, or what are you storing where it's too cold? Are there some chilling injury happening with some of your product? So next class, we'll cover coolers. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but I am going to say it is a very important piece of infrastructure on a small farm. I recommend it being one of the first things that you invest in. You can sometimes find them used. CoolBot uses an air conditioner to cool, which is a lot less, easier to install. and use rather than a traditional cooler system. So more information coming on that. A list of crops here that like to be stored at a very cool temperature. We typically have our cooler around 35 degrees, and it can be a challenge to store both crops that need to be stored very cold, and then crops that want to be a little bit warmer. Some things that you can do. So here's a list of crops that, they don't love it at 35 degrees. We were talking about melons. That is something that, I kind of try to keep out of the cooler if I can, unless it's 100 degrees out and my pack shed is really, really hot. And if I know that my melons are really ripe. The cantaloupes will still ripen after you pick them. So if you pick them at not the completely ripe stage, they'll keep ripening outside of a cooler. When I put them in the cooler, it's going to stop that ripening process. The one thing I will say is that is not helpful for shelf life with melons is to put them in a cooler, to take them out of a cooler, to put them in a cooler, take them out. That really seems to decrease the shelf life of that temperature differential and affect the texture and eating quality of the melon. So green beans and peppers, zucchini, summer squash, I'm typically storing in my cooler towards the door where it's a little bit warmer. You can also put up a panel inside your cooler to have different zones. Eggplant and melons, I try to keep them out of the cooler. Eggplant, I try to just harvest that right before sale, the day before. It's fine being out overnight for a while. And then there are some crops that don't want to be in a cooler and they will develop a chilling injury after 24 hours of being in a cooler. The tricky thing about chilling injury is you may not see it when it's in the cooler or right after you bring it out. It will develop as that product warms up back to room temperature. So you could drop it off at a buyer and then they're going to say, hey, this basil is completely black. What happened? And they may know that you don't store it in the cooler. So things like tomatoes, basil, the squash, the potatoes, and sweet potatoes are things that we don't put in the cooler. We're keeping those out. And then there's some crops where they're right on the edge. So it really does depend on what's the outside temperature, how long do you need to store this, where is this going, etc., etc. Okay, and then we're just a couple more slides here, and then we'll have some time for questions. Pest control is really, really important. Make sure that you're keeping, wildlife and pets out of your pack shed, that you're using unbaited traps. The tin cat traps are very nice for catching mice inside the pack shed. They go against the wall, the mice run in there. You need to check those daily to make sure that you're getting the rodents out of there. Otherwise, they do smell pretty badly. You can use baited traps outside your pack shed. Make sure there's no compost or produce left that will attract things in. If you have like an open air pack shed, you're using a pop-up tent for your pack shed or a carport, just make sure the weeds are weed whacked or mown so that you aren't having rodents that are nesting or living in your pack shed. So really just doing the best that you can there. Bird netting is really helpful for any lean-tos or outdoor areas. We've had a lot of issues with that and have moved more to a drop ceiling here so that birds can't nest there. And then we're able to also add some task lighting. So shelves, keeping things tidy off of the floor, some of those general practices that we talk about in the GAP and the FSMA classes to keep pests from taking residence. So here's my contact information, and feel free to email me if you have any other questions or want to talk about your particular situation. I do work with farmers as a farm advocate with emerging farmers and do some technical assistance with farmers. So there may be an opportunity I could help you at no cost to you. So reach out if that is of interest or if you have a need there. And then I think Annalisa has some resources and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions here.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Rose, do you want to go through any questions that were not answered?
Certainly. So one question is, I'm curious about your thoughts on Oxonia Active as a sanitizer option for a 3-bin wash system. Is it as is it as effective as Sanidate 5.0?
I don't know that sanitizer. Do you know that, Annalisa?
I have heard of that. It's from Ecolab. We could look into it. The main thing is just to make sure that whatever product you're using is labeled for use with produce. So there's a lot of different formulations that are a little bit different from these different companies. A lot of them do have that proxyacetic acid base, like Sanidate does. So many of them are meant for more of a food service, and they may or may not be labeled for fruit and vegetables. So just make absolute sure it says something like, often says process water, wash water, process water on the label. But I will look into Oxonio and include that in a follow-up email.
Another curing question. Are you cleaning after the curing or before the curing?
That's a good question. So typically when we are harvesting the crops that are being cured, we are brushing off the dirt, like big chunks of dirt or mud on the product, just so we're bringing less of that into our curing. Uh, I typically am not washing things before, like, I'm not washing winter squash or sweet potatoes before they're cured because part of the curing process is that the skin is going to be thicker. And so, like, sweet potatoes are extremely tender. Like, even rubbing them to get the dirt off can take the skins off. And so it is a bit of a balance between getting that, getting as much dirt off so you're not bringing a lot of dirt into, your greenhouse or wherever you're curing, but also not disturbing that skin so that it can cure and those wounds will heal. The other thing is you're handling that very gently. Like the winter squash, people want to throw that stuff around. They think that it's really hefty and sturdy, and it will bruise, that will develop into rotting. And you'll lose that. It won't be able to store. So handle it carefully as well. I didn't say that, but produce should be seen and not heard is what the mantra on our farm is what we say about it. So no throwing, no throwing of produce.
Right. Would you have resources for creating a policy for serving homegrown produce, food policy for elder care?
Um, let's see. I guess I'm not really sure what that, what it is that you're looking for. If you're looking for kind of like a training material that you can use like with volunteers or employees in terms of safe food handling. Um, a food safety plan can be part of that. That would cover that. So, Annalisa will cover that in another series. But SOPs, so standard operating procedures, if you've taken a GAP or a FSMA class, we talk a lot about that. And those are extremely helpful to develop for your farm. There's a lot of templates for that. They exist already, and you can Google those. I know there are some on the extension website as well, so that you're not creating all of that material from scratch.
In general, for cooler storage, some things are to be stored in solid containers for no airflow, others with holes for airflow. How do you feel about using wet burlap sacks as coverage for crops to keep them from drying out? We do this with broccoli.
I'm not familiar with that. I haven't ever used burlap. I mean, I for that for like a liner. Um, Broccoli, we're not using any closed containers for our crop storage. We're using either all totes or boxes that do have holes for airflow. I guess, Annalisa, I would defer that question about burlap to you. I mean, for us, we just have gotten away from using it because we can't really wash it or clean it.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a very porous material, lots of nooks and crannies. Think about the best material to touch your food is smooth, cleanable surfaces. So it's not always practical to have everything be that way. But if you think of in food service, they tend towards stainless steel for a reason, right? It's very clean. Hospitals tend towards clean, smooth surfaces. So burlap would not be able to be cleaned particularly well. So it might be something to keep in mind to just as you change your systems to kind of move into a system that would be have something that would be more cleanable.
All right. What is your protocols for gloves in the pack house? Always or only at times?
The only time we are using gloves in the pack house is if somebody has an injury and is wearing a Band-Aid or has a cut on their hand, then we are always asking them to put a nitrile glove on their hand to protect the produce from contamination from blood or a wound. I have some employees that really like to use those gloves, especially when it's cold, and that's fine. We have them available, but we just say treat it like your own hands. So you're washing your hands before you're putting on those gloves. And then if those gloves get dirty or you're touching the floor or something, you need to change your gloves. So the thing that Annalisa and I have talked about, the challenge with gloves is sometimes your hands can get dirty and you're wearing gloves and you kind of don't realize it. If you would have bare hands, you'd say, oh, my hands are really dirty. I need to wash them. So the cotton white gloves we're using more for harvesting tomatoes and then things that are prickly like cucumbers and summer squash and zucchini, more as a protection for our hands. And so those are just, as I mentioned, like a single use. So we're washing them in between, we're reusing them, but we're only using them for one crop at one time. Then they go into a dirty bin, they get washed. So you can imagine we have about 50 pairs of these cotton gloves to just be able to use. And they're really nice, especially for like tomato packing and sorting.
All right. Then, last question before someone asks or raise their hand. Do you rinse off the Sanidate?
Sanidate does not need to be rinsed off. No, you can't even tell. It's at such a diluted concentration. If you had something like lettuce that was rinsed in Sanidate wash water and lettuce that was not, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So no, yeah. And as Annalisa said, for Sanidate, the label says don't rinse. Same with surfaces. If I put it to sanitize my surface, I'm not rinsing it after with water. You're letting it sit for a couple minutes to activate.
That's it for our questions.
Great. Thank you all for coming.
I will say that we could do 8 hours on this, Laura. Would that
Yeah.
seem fair?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
1 or 2 years ago, we did an all-day organic university just on post-harvest handling. Yeah, each slide we could have spent an hour talking about it. It is,
There's a lot.
hopefully we have the opportunity to keep diving into it.
Yeah, it's a trade-off. If you say a deep dive that's 3 hours, well then people, might not have that much time. So we
Exactly.
went with an hour and 15, just kind of did it. We will end the webinar now and we will send out a follow-up email. And again, thank you so much to Laura for your wonderful years of knowledge shared with us today and to Rose for hosting.
Thank you.